She had just watched a man who'd been at the company for 90 days walk onto a stage and take everything she had spent 10 years bleeding for. No one looked at her. No one said a word. And in that silence, standing at the back of a room full of people who had told her just last week that she deserved this, Jenny Calloway made a decision that would change everything. This is the story of a woman who was pushed out, counted out, and written off, and what she built from the wreckage. Stay with me until the end. Hit like, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The fluorescent lights inside the Golden Phoenix conference room buzzed at a frequency that Jenny had always found slightly nauseating, though she'd never mentioned it to anyone. 10 years of standing under those particular lights had taught her a few things about silence: when to use it, when to push through it, and when it was being used against you. This morning, the silence was being used against her. She stood near the back wall with her arms crossed loosely at her waist, not defensive, just keeping herself together. And she watched David Marsh move toward the podium with that walk he had, the slow, wide-shouldered walk of a man who never questioned whether the room belonged to him. He adjusted the microphone once, cleared his throat, smiled at someone in the front row. Jenny already knew. She didn't know how she knew, exactly. Maybe it was the way David had avoided making eye contact with her during the morning meeting. Maybe it was the way Sandra from HR had looked at her shoes when Jenny walked past the admin wing. Maybe it was just the particular quality of the air in that room. Something charged and guilty. The way a room feels when people know something and have decided, together, not to say it. She'd been here before. Not this exact moment, but close enough. She recognized the architecture of it. David's voice came through the speakers with that corporate warmth he'd perfected, smooth and round and practiced. The voice of a man who'd delivered enough bad news in bright packaging to make it feel like a gift. He said something about exciting growth, about the future of the company, about leadership that would carry Golden Phoenix into the next decade. He talked for almost 4 minutes before he said the name. Adam Whitmore. The applause started before Jenny fully processed what had happened. It came from the front of the room first, where the executives sat, and spread backward like something contagious. People around her were clapping, people who had spent the past 3 weeks stopping by her desk to say, "It's yours, Jen. Obviously it's yours," were now pressing their palms together with what looked, from where she stood, like genuine enthusiasm. She didn't move. The man walking onto the stage was 29 years old. She knew because she'd seen his onboarding paperwork cross her desk in January when she was covering for Marcus in HR, 92 days ago. He had a firm handshake, a good suit, and the particular kind of easy confidence that came not from ever having lost anything significant, but from never having needed to. His last name was Whitmore. His father's name was on the lobby wall. David shook Adam's hand. Someone whistled. Jenny counted 7 people she had personally trained in this room. She uncrossed her arms, put her hands in her pockets, breathed out through her nose, slow and controlled, the way she'd taught herself to do in the years when slow and controlled was the only thing standing between her and a complete unraveling. Then she walked toward David. She waited until the handshakes were finished, until the little cluster of congratulations around Adam had thickened enough that nobody was watching the edges of the room. She touched David's elbow, not grabbing it, just a light contact, enough to pull his attention. "I need to leave early," she said. He turned, and for a half second she saw something in his face, not quite guilt, not quite relief, something in between, something that wanted to dissolve before she could name it. "Of course," he said. Then, "Jenny." He said her name like it was the beginning of an explanation. She waited. He ran one hand over his jaw. "You were unlucky this time. Keep working hard. Another opportunity will—" "Thank you, David." She said it clean and flat. No tremor in it. She collected her jacket from her chair, her phone from the desk, and she walked out of the building without looking at the stage. The sky outside was overcast and the air tasted like February, cold and faintly metallic. And she stood in the parking lot for a moment with her keys in her hand and just breathed. Her chest felt strange, not painful exactly, more like pressure, like something that had been inflated for a long time had just let go, and the sudden absence of it was its own kind of ache. She drove home. She sat in her car in the driveway for 11 minutes. Then she went inside to check on Derek. Her brother was at the kitchen table with his laptop open and a half-eaten sandwich beside him, and he looked up when she came in because she was home 3 hours early, and Derek noticed everything, always had, even before the accident had made him more stationary, and the stillness had sharpened whatever was already sharp in him. "That bad?" he said. "They gave it to the chairman's kid." Derek put down the sandwich. "Adam Whitmore." She looked at him. "You knew his name?" "I looked up the shortlist when you told me about the position. His LinkedIn has been up for 6 months. Private equity background, no client-facing experience." He paused. 300 connections, all of them upper management. Jenny sat down across from him. The kitchen smelled like coffee and something Derek had heated up earlier, and the familiarity of it, this small, specific life they'd built together in this house, pressed against her chest in a way that made it harder to keep her face arranged. "David told me to keep working hard," she said. "What did you say?" "Thank you." Derek made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "What are you going to do?" She looked at the table. There was a scratch along the edge of it from when Derek's chair had caught it wrong 2 winters ago, and they'd been meaning to fix it and never had. She traced it with her thumb. "I don't know yet," she said. That was not entirely true, but it was the most honest version of the answer she could give him right now, at this moment, when the decision she could feel taking shape in the back of her mind was still too raw and too new to speak out loud. The truth was that something had changed in that conference room. Not broken. She was careful about that word, had spent a long time refusing to let it apply to her. But changed, shifted. Like the moment you realize the floor you've been standing on was never actually solid and has in fact been a kind of concentrated will, and without that will to hold it together, it becomes just what it was all along. Air. She had given Golden Phoenix 10 years. Not 10 years of clocking in and going through motions, but 10 years of the kind of work that cost something, that required you to carry problems home and turn them over in the dark and show up the next morning with answers. She had rebuilt accounts that 3 separate managers had written off as unsalvageable. She had developed a retention methodology that the company's marketing materials now cited without attribution. She had trained, directly or indirectly, 14 of the current client-facing staff, including 2 people who now held senior titles. And the thing she kept coming back to, sitting at that kitchen table with the November light going flat in the windows, was not the injustice of it. She had known enough about how institutions work to hold no illusions about pure meritocracy. The thing she kept coming back to was the applause. The specific, immediate, enthusiastic applause of people who had, minutes earlier, been invested in her success. That was the part that had changed something in her, not the loss, the instant recalibration. Jenny had grown up in a house that ran on loyalty the same way a fire runs on oxygen, consuming it, making it smaller, until there was nothing left to breathe. Her father had understood loyalty as possession. Her mother had understood it as exhaustion. By the time Jenny was 16, she had understood it as something you extended carefully and withdrew without apology when the conditions changed. What she had not learned, until today, was how fast other people could do the same. She stood up, refilled her coffee, and said, "I'm going to make dinner." Derek watched her. "Jenny." "I'm fine." "I didn't say you weren't." She put water on the stove and found the box of pasta in the cabinet and stood at the counter with her hands flat on the tile, pressing her weight into it, feeling the cold of the surface against her palms. Outside, a car passed on the street. The water in the pot began to tick and shift against the heat. She had almost left Columbus 4 years ago. There had been a recruiter from a Chicago firm who'd found her profile and called twice, and she'd spoken to him both times in her car in the Golden Phoenix parking garage, listening to what he was describing, and she had made a list in her head of what she'd be leaving and what she'd be taking on and decided that the stability, the decade of built relationships, the proximity to Derek's specialist, the house they were finally 2 years away from owning outright, made staying the rational choice. She had not called the recruiter back. She thought about that now. Thought about the accumulated cost of every rational choice she'd made inside that building. And she thought about what it meant that the people she had considered her professional community had needed less than 90 seconds to redirect their loyalty to someone with a different last name. Dinner was quiet. Derek didn't press. He'd learned, in the years since she'd essentially raised him, when she was processing something that words would only interrupt. They watched a show afterward, something he'd been following, and she sat on the couch and looked at the screen without seeing it and let her mind work on the problem the way it always worked best, sideways, without forcing it, letting the pieces arrange themselves. By 10 o'clock, she knew what she was going to do. Not the specific plan, not the mechanics of it, just the direction. She was not going to spend another year inside that building waiting for recognition from people who had made it clear, today, that recognition would always bend toward whoever held the most inherited capital. She was not going to manage Adam Whitmore. She was not going to sit in another meeting where her analysis was presented through someone else's mouth and attributed to their instincts. She was going to leave. The thought should have been terrifying. They had 11 more months on the mortgage at the current rate. Derek's upcoming equipment replacement was running almost $3,000, which she'd planned to cover with the raise that was supposed to come with the promotion. Her savings were real, but not deep, the result of years of careful allocation that had never left much room for risk. Instead of terror, she felt something closer to clarity. The uncomfortable, slightly nauseating clarity of a decision that is right even when the math doesn't entirely support it. She went to bed at 11. Lay in the dark. Thought about a conversation she'd had with Derek when he was 15 and she was 21, and they were newly in Columbus and had almost nothing, and she'd told him, because she believed it, because she needed to, that the only thing they could control was what they built with their own hands, inside their own walls, on their own terms. She hadn't lived that in a long time. She got up at 6, made coffee, and sat down at the kitchen table with her laptop. She opened a blank document. She wrote her name at the top. Then she wrote, resignation letter. She didn't finish it that morning. She wasn't ready. But she saved the document and she closed the laptop and she drove to Golden Phoenix and she did her job, because until she left, she was going to do her job. And she sat through the Monday meeting where Adam was formally introduced to the department, and she watched him speak and she assessed him the way she assessed every new variable in a system. He wasn't stupid. She needed to be honest about that. His advertising strategy had real logic in it. Aggressive, expensive logic that prioritized visible numbers over durable growth, but logic nonetheless. He had a kind of energy that rooms responded to, the particular magnetism of someone who had always believed the room was meant for him. He would make decisions fast, and he would make some of them badly, and he would not understand for a long time why. She gave herself 3 months. She would stay 3 months. She would find her next position. She would leave cleanly without burning anything she didn't have to burn. And she would take every piece of knowledge she'd spent 10 years accumulating and she would build something with it that no one could take from her. That was the plan. It lasted 6 weeks. Because 6 weeks after the announcement, on a Thursday evening when she'd stayed late to finish a client analysis, she was walking down the corridor past the East Conference Room and the door was slightly open and Adam's voice was coming through it. And she heard David respond, and she stopped. Not because she was eavesdropping, because she heard her name. She stood 3 feet from the door in the empty corridor with the overhead lights humming and her laptop bag on her shoulder, and she listened. Adam was saying that her retention model created internal resistance to his growth strategy. He was saying that her influence with the client team was a structural problem. He was saying about, and this was the part that settled over Jenny like cold water, that the simplest solution was to reduce her scope incrementally until she voluntarily left or until removing her became low risk. David said, "She's our top performer." Adam said, "She was. Strategy's changing. She doesn't fit the new direction." There was a pause. David said, "Give it time." Adam said, "I'm giving it exactly as much time as it needs." Jenny walked to her desk. She sat down. Her hands were perfectly steady. She found this more alarming than shaking would have been. The stillness of her hands, the absolute quiet of her body, while something inside her was rearranging itself permanently. She opened the resignation letter she had been editing in slow increments for 6 weeks. She read it once. She changed 3 months' notice to 2 weeks. She saved it. She looked at the window across from her desk, the one that looked out onto the Franklin Street side of the building, and she could see the faint reflection of herself in the dark glass. A woman sitting very still at a desk that had been hers for 10 years, in a building she had helped make successful, and she thought about her father taking the money. She thought about the specific feeling of having built something and then watching someone else decide they owned it. She was not going to wait to be managed out. She was not going to give Adam Whitmore the satisfaction of a slow erosion. She printed the letter in the morning, signed it, and placed it on David's desk before 8 a.m. She was in the parking lot with her box, not a large box. She'd never been someone who decorated much, just a few things, a small plant, a notepad, a framed quote Derek had given her years ago that said simply, "Results speak." When her phone rang, David's name on the screen. She looked at it. She put the phone in her bag. She drove away from Golden Phoenix for the last time with no new job waiting, no safety net fully intact, and a clarity in her chest that was almost frightening in how clean it felt. She was 33 years old. She had almost no margin. She had a brother who depended on her, a mortgage that needed paying, and a decade of expertise that the market was apparently uncertain how to value. She had made harder decisions with less. What Jenny did not know yet, what she could not have known on that particular February morning, was that 6 miles across Columbus, in a rented office above a dry cleaning shop on Broad Street, a 26-year-old named Miles Arden was staring at a piece of software he'd spent 2 years building and a list of 5 clients and a spreadsheet that was running out of optimistic interpretations, and that his assistant had just forwarded him, for reasons she couldn't fully explain, a profile she'd found while looking for something else entirely. A profile with Jenny Calloway's name on it. The office above the dry cleaning shop on Broad Street smelled like solvent and old carpet, and the heating unit in the corner made a sound like someone repeatedly clearing their throat and never quite finishing. Miles Arden had stopped noticing the smell around month 4. The sound still bothered him. He was 26 years old, and he had built something genuinely useful, and he was watching it die in slow motion, which was, he had discovered, considerably worse than watching something fail fast. The software worked. That was the maddening part. The software worked, and the data it produced was real, and the clients who used it saw measurable improvements in their customer return rates, and none of that had translated into the kind of traction that kept a company breathing past the 18-month mark. Miles had 5 clients. He'd had 7 in October and lost 2 in November when their parent companies restructured and froze vendor contracts. He had enough runway, according to his spreadsheet, for approximately 4 more months at current burn rate, which was a number he'd been staring at for 3 weeks without finding a way to make it larger. His assistant, Priya, was 23 and had been working for deferred salary since September, a fact that Miles thought about every morning when he unlocked the office door and every night when he locked it again. On a Thursday in February, Priya knocked on his open door and stood there with her laptop held against her chest like a shield. "I want to show you something," she said, "and I want you to hear me out before you tell me we can't afford it." Miles leaned back. His chair made a sound. "Okay." "I was pulling contact lists for the Columbus Business Journal Outreach, and I found a profile." She crossed the room and turned the laptop toward him. "This woman, Jenny Calloway, she just left Golden Phoenix." Miles looked at the screen. The profile was clean, minimal, the kind that a person built when they knew what they were doing and didn't need ornamentation to prove it. 10 years at a single company. Top seller, 3 consecutive years. A specific methodology listed under accomplishments, something about customer retention architecture, with language precise enough that Miles felt the small particular alertness he got when he encountered a person who understood systems. "She just left?" he said. "As in, this week?" He looked at the profile again. "She's a salesperson. She's the person who figured out why Golden Phoenix's biggest clients were churning in 2019 and rebuilt 4 of those accounts from scratch." Priya tapped the screen. I cross-referenced. Their retention numbers shifted significantly that year. Her name's attached to 2 internal case studies they accidentally left public. Miles was quiet for a moment. "We can't afford a senior hire." "I know. If we offer equity, she'll laugh at us." "Maybe," Priya said. "Or maybe she just walked out of a company that overlooked her for 10 years and she's sitting somewhere right now thinking about what she actually wants to do next." She straightened up. "I think you should call her." Miles looked at the spreadsheet still open on his own screen. The number in the runway cell hadn't changed. "Get me a contact," he said. The first call lasted 4 minutes. Jenny answered on the 3rd ring. her voice neutral and slightly guarded. The voice of someone who had been fielding calls from recruiters for a week and had developed a quick internal triage for sorting useful from wasteful. Miles introduced himself, named the company, and heard the small pause that told him she was either looking it up in real time or running a search through her memory and not finding much. "New line," she said. "Customer behavior analytics." "That's right." "5 clients," she said. "Revenue under 2 million. He didn't bother asking how she knew. "Correct on both counts." Another pause. "What do you want, Mr. Arden?" "I want to buy you coffee and show you something." "I'm not looking for a sales position." "I'm not offering one." He said it before he'd fully decided whether it was true. "I'm looking for a partner." The silence this time was different, longer. He could hear faint background noise on her end, a television, maybe, or a radio. And then she said, "Where?" They met at a diner on 5th Street, the kind of place with vinyl booths and a counter and coffee that came in heavy white mugs without asking. Jenny arrived 3 minutes before him and had already ordered when he came through the door, which told him something he filed away without analyzing yet. She was in a dark green coat that she kept on throughout the meeting, sitting with both hands around her mug, and she watched him cross the room with the focused, assessing look of a person who had been evaluated by other people for most of her professional life and had quietly developed the capacity to do it back. Miles sat down, ordered coffee, put his laptop on the table. "Before you open that," Jenny said, "tell me what the actual problem is." He looked at her. "Not the pitch," she said. "The real problem. The thing that's keeping you up." He closed the laptop, considered. "My software tells businesses exactly where they're hemorrhaging repeat customers. The data is accurate. The insights are actionable. And I cannot get the people who need it most to understand why it matters before they've already decided to spend their budget on finding new customers instead. Because acquiring new customers feels like growth," Jenny said. "Right. And retaining existing ones feels like maintenance." "Yes. Even though retention is almost always cheaper and more predictable." "Significantly." She nodded slowly, drank her coffee. "And your current sales approach is feature-focused. Here's what the software does, here's the data output, here's the dashboard." He paused. "It's not working." "No," she agreed. "It wouldn't." She set her mug down. "You're showing them a tool when you should be showing them a loss." Miles was quiet. "Before I sold anything at Golden Phoenix," Jenny said, "I built a model that calculated exactly how much money a specific client was losing each month by not following up with dormant accounts. I put that number at the top of the first slide. Not what I was offering them, what they were already losing." She looked at him steadily. The meeting that followed was the shortest closing I ever had. Miles opened his laptop. This time, she let him. They talked for 2 hours and 18 minutes. The diner filled and thinned around them, and they didn't notice. At some point, Priya texted Miles asking how it was going, and he typed back, "Still here," and put the phone face down. Jenny asked detailed questions about the data architecture, about the client integration process, about the specific friction points in the onboarding. And the questions were precise enough that Miles stopped performing and started just answering, which was its own kind of relief. The relief of being in a room with someone who was operating at the same frequency without requiring translation. By the end of it, she had sketched on 3 napkins. He had filled 2 pages in his notebook. "I'm not taking a salary cut to join a company with 4-month runway," she said. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement, delivered with the directness of a person who had learned that ambiguity about money costs more than clarity. "I know. But I'm also not walking back into a building where someone else owns what I build." She looked at the napkins. "What are you actually offering?" 20% equity, seat at the table on every major decision, defined role as co-founder, not employee. He met her eyes. "I built the system. I need someone who knows how to make the market feel what it means." The pause this time felt different from the ones before it. This one had weight in it, the weight of calculation and something older than calculation, something more like recognition. I need a week, she said. Take 2. She took 8 days. The first thing Jenny did when she came back with her answer was not say yes. She sat across from Miles in the Broad Street office, her first time seeing it, and she looked around it with an expression Miles couldn't quite read, something that was not quite pity and not quite amusement, the look of a person who had worked in difficult circumstances and was making an honest assessment of these ones, and she put a document on the desk. Before I agree to anything, she said, I need to know we're aligned on this. He picked up the document. It was 4 pages, handwritten on her end and then typed, and it outlined what she called a founding philosophy. The company would sell on demonstrated loss, not feature value. Pricing would be transparent. Client relationships would be managed with a retention-first model, which she acknowledged was a deliberate irony given what they were selling. Equity agreements would be in writing before she made a single call on behalf of New Line. Miles read all 4 pages. One question, he said. Go ahead. The pricing transparency clause. Some enterprise clients are going to push back on, then they're not our clients, she said, simply without heat. I spent 10 years building things for people who benefited from the ambiguity. I'm not doing it again. He looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up a pen and signed the bottom of the last page. She signed below him. Priya, who had been sitting at the edge of her desk pretending to look at something on her screen, turned around and said, Does this mean I get my back pay? Jenny looked at her. Write down the number. The first 3 months were the kind of difficult that doesn't announce itself dramatically, but settles in like weather, a persistent, bone-level cold that you adjust to without noticing how much the adjustment costs. Jenny rebuilt the entire sales approach from scratch while simultaneously managing the 5 existing client accounts, which required a bimodal attention that left her running on 6 hours of sleep and 3 cups of coffee before noon. She restructured the pitch deck 3 times. She rewrote the onboarding materials. She sat in on 2 client calls with Miles and watched the specific moment, the same moment each time, when a prospect's face shifted from polite engagement to actual concern, the moment when she put the loss number on the screen. She started calling it the recognition point, the moment a company stopped seeing a software demo and started seeing their own money disappearing. The 6th client signed in April, the 7th in May. Miles watched Jenny work with the focused attention of someone studying a method he'd been looking for without knowing its name. She didn't close deals the way he'd seen salespeople close deals. There was no pressure architecture, no manufactured urgency, no language designed to move someone toward a decision before they'd arrive there naturally. She simply made the loss visible and then waited, with a patience that was almost uncomfortable to be in the room with, for the client to finish calculating. It worked with a consistency that Miles found slightly unnerving and deeply reassuring in equal measure. By June, they had 11 clients. By August, 17. The runway cell in the spreadsheet changed character. It stopped being a countdown and started being a projection. And then Marcus Hale called. Marcus was a VP at a mid-sized retail company in Cincinnati, and he had been referred to New Line by 2 separate sources. And his first call with Jenny lasted 40 minutes and ended with him saying he needed to bring this to his board and would be in touch within 2 weeks. Jenny marked it in the pipeline with measured optimism and told Miles it was a potential 6-figure annual contract. 2 weeks passed. Then 3. When Marcus finally called back, his voice had a different quality than the first conversation. Flatter, slightly careful, the quality of a person who had received information they weren't sure how to deliver. I want to be straight with you, he said. My board liked the concept. They pushed back on your pricing model. Which part? Jenny said. The transparency clause. They want the standard tiered structure with, We've explained our pricing approach in every preliminary conversation, Mr. Hale. It's not a negotiating position. A pause. I understand that. The issue is that 2 of my board members want to run this past your competition first. Jenny's pen stopped moving. Who did they contact? I'm not sure I'm supposed to... He stopped. Golden Phoenix. They've apparently built out an analytics division. The room felt different after she hung up. Not smaller, exactly. Just differently shaped, the walls at slightly altered angles. The way a space can change when you learn something in it that rearranges what you thought was fixed. She sat very still. Miles was in the doorway. He'd caught enough of the conversation. How long have they had an analytics division? They didn't, she said. When I left, there was no analytics division. There was a client insight team that ran quarterly reports. She set the phone down. Someone built it out. She already knew who. Adam Whitmore had spent 6 months implementing his growth strategy, which had produced exactly the short-term numbers he'd promised, and had begun, according to the 2 former Golden Phoenix clients Jenny had spoken with in other contexts, to create the kind of invisible structural damage that wouldn't show up in quarterly reports until it was expensive to repair. A smart person in his position, realizing the limits of pure acquisition growth, would pivot toward retention analytics, would recognize the gap Jenny had identified years ago and move to fill it with company resources and a budget that Newline could not match. Would, in effect, use her own methodology against her. She drove home that evening on autopilot, the Columbus streets unremarkable around her, and she sat in Derek's kitchen and ate the food he'd made. He cooked now, had gotten good at it in the past year, had developed in particular precision with it that she recognized as his version of control in a life where other kinds of control were limited. And she told him what had happened with Marcus Hale. Derek listened without interrupting. What do you know about their new analytics pitch? He asked when she finished. Nothing specific. Find out, he said. It wasn't impatient, just practical. I know. Because if they're using your framework, I know, Derek. He looked at her. Are you okay? I'm thinking. You look like you're not okay. She looked at him across the table, this man she'd carried and been carried by in different directions for 15 years, and she said, I built that methodology inside their walls using their data. I never patented it. I never documented it as mine in any enforceable way. If they're using it, she stopped. There may not be anything I can do about the framework itself. Derek was quiet. Then, but they're not you. No. They can copy the method. They can't copy what you know about why it works. She nodded, slowly, and the things she'd been turning over all evening began to clarify. Derek was right, in the way he was often right, cutting straight to the structural fact beneath the emotional noise. Golden Phoenix could build an analytics division. They could approximate her approach. They had resources and existing client relationships and a name that Marcus Hale's board recognized. What they did not have was the specific knowledge of where that approach failed, and why, and how to correct for it. Because Jenny had built the original version of the methodology, and she had spent 3 years watching it succeed and 18 months watching Adam's team make decisions that she had predicted, internally would create specific problems at specific pressure points, and she had never told anyone which points those were. She went back to the office at 9 that evening. Priya had gone home. Miles was there, a habit of his, working late with headphones in, and the particular slightly disheveled focus of someone who did his best thinking after dark. He pulled the headphones off when she came in. I need to know what Golden Phoenix is pitching, she said. How do we find that out? She sat down. Do you know a company called Vertex Retail Solutions? I've heard of them. They were a Golden Phoenix client until March. They left over a contract dispute. I know their head of operations from a conference in 2021. She opened her laptop. If Golden Phoenix has been pitching analytics to mid-size retail, Vertex is exactly the kind of company they'd go after. And Vertex has no reason to keep that pitch deck confidential. Miles watched her. It might be nothing, she said. Their analytics division might be building something completely different. But you don't think so? No, she said. I don't. She sent the email to Vertex that night and received a response the following morning that was friendly and unsurprised and contained an attached file that she opened without fully preparing herself for what she was going to see. The deck was 12 slides. The framework was different in surface detail, different language, different visual structure, different brand presentation. But the underlying logic was identical to what Jenny had spent 3 years developing inside Golden Phoenix. The data hierarchy, the loss framing approach, the specific way the retention model built out from existing customer behavior rather than new acquisition targets. She went through it twice. Then she called Miles. He came in and sat across from her, and she walked him through it without commentary, slide by slide. And when she got to the end, he was quiet for a long moment. "Is this legally actionable?" he said. "Probably not. I developed it on their time using their resources. Even if I could establish authorship, the enforcement case is—" She shook her head. "Long, expensive, distracting. Then what do we do?" She looked at the last slide. It had their logo in the corner, the Golden Phoenix logo, the one she'd walked past every morning for 10 years. And she felt something that was not quite anger and not quite grief. Something colder than both. Something that had the specific texture of a decision that has been building for a long time and is now fully formed. "We go faster," she said. "We don't fight them over what I already built. We build what I didn't get to build because they stopped me." She met his eyes. "We go after the enterprise market. The mid-sized companies they're pitching are practice rounds. The real money is in the companies large enough to have systemic retention problems. Retail chains, regional banks, healthcare networks. Clients Golden Phoenix can't service at the level they need. We don't have the infrastructure for—" "Not yet," she said. "We need investment." The word sat in the space between them. They had talked around it for months, with the mutual wariness of two people who had watched what outside capital did to companies that weren't ready for it. "If we take investment," Miles said carefully, "we lose the control structure we've built." "If we don't take investment," Jenny said, "Golden Phoenix eats our market segment with my own methodology, and we spend the next 2 years fighting over the same 5 clients." She paused. "We need to move now, Miles, before they establish enough enterprise presence that we're starting from behind." Miles looked at the deck on her screen. He picked up his coffee cup, set it down without drinking. "How much are you thinking?" "Enough to hire 3 senior client executives, upgrade the platform architecture, and run a genuine enterprise pilot with 2 anchor clients." She'd done the number in her head on the drive over, somewhere between 8 and 12 million. The silence that followed was the kind that had its own weight, its own particular gravity. Miles stared at the wall above her head. Jenny watched him and waited, because she had learned in the past months that Miles Arden needed to arrive at difficult decisions himself, needed to turn them over until they felt like his own conclusion, rather than someone else's instruction, which was a quality she had learned to respect even when it required patience she wasn't naturally built for. "I know 2 people who might be interested," he said finally. "One's a former professor who runs a small growth fund. The other is a family office that did a round with a Columbus startup last year." "Make the calls tomorrow," Jenny said. "If we do this—" He stopped, started again. "If we take this money and build for enterprise and it doesn't work, then we fail bigger than we were already going to fail," she said. "But we fail on our terms, doing the thing we actually believed in." He looked at her for a long time. Then he nodded. She drove home at midnight through streets that were empty and faintly lit, and she felt the particular sensation she recognized from the 2 or 3 other moments in her life when she had crossed a line that could not be recrossed. Not frightening exactly, just final, the way a door sounds when it closes in a building you're not going back into. She was in bed by 12:30 and awake at 3, not with anxiety, but with something more like activation, her mind already running the sequencing. Which enterprise targets to approach first, what the pilot structure needed to look like, how to position New Line's methodology as categorically superior to Golden Phoenix's imitation without mentioning Golden Phoenix by name. At 4 in the morning, she got up and went to the kitchen. Derek was already there. He looked up from his laptop, unsurprised, the way he always was when she appeared at unexpected hours. He'd never slept well either, never had. And there was something in the family blood that ran toward night thinking, toward the kind of clarity that only came when the rest of the world was quiet. "Investment round," she said. He looked at her, waited. "It's the only move that makes sense, and it means if it goes wrong, we lose more than we've lost before." Derek closed the laptop slowly. He said, "You've never made a move because it was safe. I've made moves because they were calculated. Same thing with you." He looked at her steadily. This man who had never been able to run from anything and had therefore learned a different relationship with stillness and difficulty than most people ever developed. "What does your gut say?" Jenny looked at the kitchen table, at the scratch along the edge that they'd never fixed. "It says go," she said. "Then go," Derek said. She was back in bed by 4:30. She slept 4 hours straight through without dreaming. In the morning, she called Marcus Hale back. "Mr. Hale," she said before he could speak, "I'm going to send you something, not a deck, a projection, specific to your company based on the behavioral data your industry cohort has made public. It will show you exactly what Golden Phoenix's approach will cost you in year 2, she paused. "After you've read it, I'd like 30 minutes with your board." A silence. Then, "When can you send it?" "End of day," she said. She had 17 hours. She would be done in 12. And by the time Marcus Hale's board opened that projection and saw the number at the top of the first page, the real number, the one that represented what their current customer behavior was costing them every single month while they compared vendor decks, Jenny already knew what they were going to do. She'd seen that moment of recognition too many times to mistake it for anything else. What she didn't yet know was that David Marsh had forwarded her resignation letter to someone outside the company 3 days after she'd submitted it, not out of malice, but out of the particular carelessness of a man who had never fully understood what he had while he had it. And that the person he'd forwarded it to had shown it to someone else, and that chain of carelessness had reached, in the way that information always finds its most inconvenient destination, the one person in Columbus whose involvement would change everything Jenny thought she understood about how far this fight was going to go. The projection took Jenny 11 hours and 40 minutes to build, not 12, and when she sent it to Marcus Hale at 6:53 in the evening, she sat back in her chair and felt the particular emptiness that follows concentrated work. Not satisfaction exactly, more like the absence of pressure, the way a held breath feels when it finally releases. Miles had gone home at 9. Priya had left at 7. The office was quiet in the specific way of empty buildings at night, all the ambient noise of other people gone, just the heating unit clearing its throat in the corner and the faint sound of traffic on Broad Street below. Jenny closed her laptop. She sat in the dark for a few minutes, not thinking, just existing in the space between the decision that had been made and the consequences that hadn't arrived yet. Then she drove home. Marcus Hale's assistant called the next morning at 8:47 to confirm the board meeting for Thursday. Jenny wrote the time in her notebook, closed it, and spent the next 2 days preparing for a presentation that she already knew, in the specific cellular way she trusted above formal analysis, was going to close. She was right. The board meeting lasted 50 minutes. Jenny put the loss number on the screen in the first 4 minutes, the real number, the one she'd calculated from Hale's publicly available industry data and 3 comparable company profiles. And she watched it move through the room the way a cold front moves, that invisible shift in atmospheric pressure, the moment when everyone in the space is feeling the same thing at slightly different delays. Marcus Hale signed a letter of intent on Friday afternoon. It was the largest single contract in New Line's history, not by a small margin, but by a factor that changed the shape of the spreadsheet in a fundamental way. Miles stared at the number for a long time without speaking. Priya made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Jenny wrote it in her notebook and closed it and said, "Now we call the investors." The investor meetings began the following week. Miles's former professor, a compact, careful man named Robert Finch, who ran a small growth fund from an office in Worthington and wore the same style of reading glasses in every photo Jenny could find of him, met them for lunch on a Tuesday and spent most of it asking Jenny questions rather than Miles, which Jenny recognized as either a good sign or a test, and either way answered with the same directness she brought to everything. "Your growth rate is real," Finch said, looking at the numbers they'd brought. "The Marcus Hale contract is significant." He set the paper down. "My concern is defensibility. You've built a methodology. What stops a larger player from replicating it?" "Nothing," Jenny said. Finch looked at her. "A larger player has already started replicating it," she said. "We know this. The replication is surface level. They have the framework without the understanding of where it fails and why. Our advantage isn't the methodology itself. It's the accumulated knowledge of its failure points and how to correct for them in real client environments." She paused. "That knowledge isn't in a deck. It's in the people who built it." Finch was quiet for a moment. Then, "Who's the larger player?" "Golden Phoenix," Miles said. Something moved across Finch's face, brief and controlled. "I know someone on their board," he said, not apologetically, just as a fact being placed on the table. "I know," Jenny said. "His name is Gerald Whitmore." The silence that followed had a particular quality. Finch picked up his water glass, set it down. "You did your homework." "We're asking for your money," Jenny said. "You should expect that." He smiled at that, a small, genuine one. "I'll want to see the full due diligence package and speak with 2 of your current clients directly." "I'll have it to you by end of week," she said. The second investor meeting with the family office Miles had mentioned, a firm called Caldwell Partners that operated out of a glass and steel building near Easton and managed money for 3 generations of a Cincinnati family, was scheduled for the following Monday. Jenny and Miles spent the weekend preparing. On Saturday morning, Jenny's phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer. She'd been fielding recruiter calls and industry contacts, and one bewildering call from a journalist at a Columbus business publication who'd heard about the Hale contract and wanted a comment, and she'd developed the habit of letting unknowns go to voicemail. But something, the particular quality of the Saturday morning quiet, the cup of coffee in her other hand, the fact that Derek was in the other room and she was standing in a patch of winter sunlight in the kitchen, made her answer. "Ms. Calloway." The voice was male, older, the voice of a person who had spent decades in rooms where they controlled the temperature. "My name is Gerald Whitmore." She set the coffee cup down on the counter very carefully. "I believe you know who I am," he said. "Yes," she said. "Good. That saves time." A pause. "I'd like to meet with you. This week, if possible." Jenny looked out the kitchen window at the yard, at the dormant grass and the bare tree along the fence line. Her mind was already running the analysis, the why, the timing, the specific calculus of what a man in Gerald Whitmore's position would want from a meeting with her at this particular moment. "What would we be meeting about, Mr. Whitmore?" she said. "New line," he said, "and a proposal I think you'll find worth your time." She was supposed to say she'd check her calendar. She was supposed to create some distance, some negotiating space. Instead, she said, "Tuesday, 11 o'clock. You come to our office." A brief pause. She wondered if he was surprised. Men like Gerald Whitmore were rarely surprised. "Tuesday," he agreed. 11. She hung up and stood in the kitchen for 30 seconds. Then she went to find Derek. He was at his desk, which meant he was working, which meant she was going to interrupt him, which she did without apology because 15 years of shared space had dissolved most of the formalities. She told him about the call. Derek listened with his hands flat on the desk, which was his stillness posture, the one he adopted when he was processing quickly and didn't want his body to distract from his thinking. "He knows about Finch," Derek said. "Yes. And he knows about Caldwell." "Probably." Derek looked at her. "What's he going to offer?" "I don't know yet." "What are you going to say?" "I don't know that either," she said, "but I want to know what he wants before I decide." She told Miles that evening. She expected him to be unsettled. Miles's equilibrium was more fragile than hers under certain kinds of pressure, a fact she'd observed without judgment and worked around. But he surprised her. "Okay," he said. "Okay?" "We hear what he says. We don't commit to anything. We learn what we can." He was quiet. "He didn't call because we're small and irrelevant." "No," she said. "He didn't." Gerald Whitmore arrived at the Broad Street office at 11:02 on Tuesday. He was 64 years old and carried himself with the specific gravity of a man who had never had to raise his voice to be taken seriously. He wore a charcoal coat and looked briefly, with no visible reaction, at the carpet smell in the heating unit and the narrow room with its second-hand furniture, and then sat down across from Jenny and Miles as though he sat in offices exactly like this one every week. Jenny had arranged it deliberately. She hadn't borrowed a conference room or found a more impressive location. She'd wanted him in their space, on their terms, reading their walls. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Thank you for seeing me." His eyes moved across her face with a measured, professional attention. "I'll be direct." "Please," Jenny said. "Golden Phoenix is expanding into analytics. You know this. Our current methodology is—" He paused almost imperceptibly. "Derivative of work that was developed internally during your tenure." The word derivative was careful. Jenny noted it. "We're aware of your work with Marcus Hale," Whitmore continued. "We're aware of your investor conversations." He folded his hands on the table. "I'm here to offer a partnership." Miles straightened slightly. "A formal collaboration," Whitmore said. "New Line operates as a premium analytics division under the Golden Phoenix umbrella. Full operational autonomy. Existing equity structure preserved. Golden Phoenix provides capital, client network, and institutional infrastructure." Jenny said nothing. "The number we're prepared to invest," Whitmore said, and named a figure that was slightly larger than the top of the range she'd discussed with Miles. The room was quiet enough that the heating unit was audible. "What does Golden Phoenix want in return?" Jenny said. 15% equity, licensing rights to the core methodology, a seat on your advisory board." He met her eyes. "And a consulting arrangement with our analytics division." She looked at him steadily. "Meaning I help your analytics division with the problems they're running into using the framework they built from my work." Nothing moved in Whitmore's face. "We'd prefer to call it a collaborative knowledge-sharing arrangement." "I'm sure you would." She stood up, not aggressively, just to move, and walked to the window and looked down at Broad Street. A delivery truck was double-parked below. A woman was walking a dog. Ordinary Tuesday morning life, indifferent to what was happening in this room. "Mr. Whitmore, how did you know about Finch?" A pause. "We have relationships in the investment community." "Finch called you?" she said. It wasn't a question. Another pause, slightly longer. "Robert and I have spoken." She turned around. "When?" "Last week." Miles looked at her. She looked at Miles. Something passed between them in that exchange, something that didn't require language, the specific communication of two people who have been in enough difficult situations together to have developed a shorthand. "I'd like to speak with Mr. Finch," Jenny said. "Of course." Whitmore reached into his coat. "I expected you might." He placed a card on the table. It was not his own card. It was Robert Finch's, and handwritten on the back was a phone number she didn't recognize, different from the one she had for Finch. She looked at the card. She picked it up. She set it back down. "I'll need a few days to consider your proposal," she said. Whitmore stood. He buttoned his coat with the unhurried precision of a man with nowhere he needed to be. "Of course, I'd ask that you be mindful of the time sensitivity. Our analytics division is moving quickly." "I understand," Jenny said. She walked him to the door and said goodbye and closed the door behind him and stood with her back to it. Miles said, "Finch played us." "Maybe," she said. "He took our due diligence package to Whitmore. Everything we sent him, client names, revenue projections, methodology documentation. I know. Jenny, I know." She crossed the room and sat down and stared at the table. Her hands were in her lap. She was pressing her thumbs against her index fingers, a pressure habit she'd had since she was a teenager, invisible to everyone else, just enough sensation to keep the edges of her thinking sharp. "I need to call Finch." She called him from her cell phone, standing outside on the sidewalk in the February cold, because she needed air, and because she didn't want Miles hearing her voice if it went somewhere she didn't intend. Finch answered on the second ring, which told her he'd been waiting. "Robert," she said. "Jenny." He sounded careful, not guilty. Not quite. More like a person managing a situation they'd already accepted and were now navigating toward the least damaging conclusion. "Tell me what happened," she said. A pause. "Gerald reached out to me after our lunch. He was aware of New Line already. He asked me about my impressions. And you told him." "I told him you were serious and your numbers were real." A beat. "I didn't share the full package." "But you confirmed enough that he could move." Silence. "Robert." Her voice was flat and cold, the voice she used when the politeness was no longer serving anything. "Did you share our client projections with Gerald Whitmore?" The pause was too long. The broad strokes, Finch said. Not the... She hung up. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment with the phone in her hand and the cold pressing through her coat and a streetcar going past on the road, making the particular metal sound of its rails. She thought about the due diligence package she'd spent a weekend building. She thought about the client names in it, the revenue architecture, the methodology documentation that she'd included because Finch had explicitly asked for it, and she'd trusted the ask. She thought about the word derivative in Gerald Whitmore's mouth. She went back upstairs. Miles was on his feet. He'd been pacing, she could tell from the way he stopped when she came in, mid-step, like someone caught. "How bad?" he said. Finch shared enough that Whitmore could structure a real offer. She sat down. "He has our client list. He has the revenue projections. He knows what we need from investors because we documented it for Finch." Miles sat down across from her. He rubbed his face with both hands, a gesture she'd seen him make in the early months when the runway number was still a countdown. "Caldwell," he said, "they're our other option. Is Caldwell connected to Whitmore?" "I don't know." She was already opening her laptop. "I'm finding out." It took 40 minutes. The Caldwell family office had invested in a Golden Phoenix subsidiary in 2019, a minor position, a footnote in their portfolio, but a connection. Whether that connection translated to loyalty or information sharing was a question she couldn't answer from public records, but the existence of it was enough. "We can't trust Caldwell," she said. Miles looked at her. "Then we have no investor path." "Not the one we planned." "The Hale contract isn't enough to fund enterprise expansion." "No." "So He stopped. "We're not done," she said. "We're not taking Whitmore's offer. That's the one thing I know. Jenny, if we turn down the offer and we can't find alternative capital, Golden Phoenix eats our market segment in 12 months. Maybe less." "I know. And we built this thing to..." His voice had something in it she hadn't heard before, a thin edge of exhaustion and something raw beneath it. "I've been working on this for 2 years, before you came. 2 years on less sleep than I should have had, with Priya on deferred salary because she believed in it, and I..." He stopped himself, breathed. "I'm not saying quit. I'm saying I need to know there's a real option here." She looked at him, at the genuine weariness in his face, the specific kind that came from someone who had been running on belief when there wasn't enough evidence, and she felt something that was not quite tenderness, but was close to it, a recognition, the specific recognition of one person who had carried something heavy for a long time looking at another person doing the same. "There's another option," she said. He waited. "We go to Whitmore's competitors." Miles was quiet. Golden Phoenix has 3 direct competitors in the Columbus market. 2 of them have been trying to break into analytics for 18 months and failing. If we approach them with a proper enterprise package, she was already running it in her head. Not as a company seeking investment, as a company offering a partnership that gives them something Golden Phoenix has, and they don't. "We'd be taking a side in a competitive war." "We're already in one," Jenny said. "We just didn't choose our side yet." The next 3 days were the kind that compressed time in strange ways. Jenny was on calls from 7 in the morning until sometimes 9 at night, working every contact she had from 10 years at Golden Phoenix to find the right entry point into Meridian Group, the largest of Golden Phoenix's direct competitors, a company she had studied extensively during her final year at Golden Phoenix when she'd run a competitive analysis that David had filed and never read. She found her entry point through a woman named Carol Stanton, a senior VP at Meridian who had sat on a panel with Jenny at a Columbus Chamber event 3 years earlier. They had spoken for 20 minutes about customer retention strategy. Jenny remembered it clearly. She had no way of knowing whether Carol remembered her. Carol remembered her. The meeting was set for the following Monday. Jenny and Miles spent the weekend building the most precise and honest and ruthlessly well-evidenced pitch they had ever constructed. And on Sunday evening, with the office looking like the aftermath of something, papers and laptops and coffee cups, and the particular organized chaos of 2 people who had been working in the same space for 17 hours, Miles looked up from his screen and said, "What if Meridian knows Whitmore too?" "They do," Jenny said. "Everyone knows Whitmore. That's not the question." "What's the question?" Whether they want what we have more than they want to stay on safe terms with him. Miles looked at her. And if they don't? Jenny closed her laptop. She looked at the surface of the table between them, at the coffee cup rings and the pen marks and the small geography of a company being built in a second-hand space above a dry cleaning shop. Then we find out something true about where we stand, and we make the next decision from there. He nodded slowly. He looked exhausted. Okay. She went home at 10. She made tea she didn't drink. She sat at the kitchen table and thought not about the pitch, or the Meridian meeting, or Gerald Whitmore, or Robert Finch's careful voice on the phone, but about the moment she'd walked out of Golden Phoenix with that small box in her hands, and the February air in her face, and the specific sensation of having chosen something she couldn't unchoose. She was still choosing it. The question was whether the ground she'd chosen to stand on was going to hold. Monday came. The Meridian offices were on the 12th floor of a building on High Street, clean and institutional and everything the Broad Street office was not. And Carol Stanton met them in a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the city and a face that was professionally warm and privately evaluating. They were 20 minutes into the pitch when Carol's phone buzzed on the table. She silenced it without looking. It buzzed again. She looked at it this time briefly, and something changed in her face. Just a flicker, but Jenny had spent 10 years reading rooms. Carol excused herself for 4 minutes. She came back and sat down, and there was a quality to her stillness that hadn't been there before. She said, "I need to ask you something directly." "Please," Jenny said. "Did you receive an offer from Golden Phoenix this week?" The air in the room changed temperature. "We received a proposal," Jenny said carefully. "We haven't responded to it." Carol looked at her. "Gerald Whitmore called our CEO this morning." Jenny felt the information land the way a heavy object lands. Not painfully, but with undeniable physical weight, the sensation of something displacing everything around it. "He told us you were in discussions with Golden Phoenix about a formal partnership," Carol said. "He implied the deal was close to finalized." Miles was very still beside Jenny. "He also shared," Carol continued, her voice now carrying the careful neutrality of a professional delivering something she found distasteful, "a document, a methodology overview with New Line's branding on it and what appeared to be confidential client data." Jenny did not move. She kept her face arranged. She kept her breathing steady. Inside her chest, something was happening that had no clean name. Not anger, not yet, not fear. Something more fundamental than both. The sensation of a foundation being pulled from beneath a structure you have spent every available resource building. Finch hadn't just shared the broad strokes. He'd shared the package. "Ms. Calloway," Carol said, "I'm not in a position to move forward with a partnership discussion under these circumstances. Not until the relationship with Golden Phoenix is clarified." She paused. "I'm sorry. I think what you've built is genuinely impressive." Jenny stood. She extended her hand. Carol shook it. Miles shook it. The handshakes were brief and courteous and completely hollow, and then they were in the elevator going down, and then they were on the street, and the air was cold and bright and indifferent, and Miles turned to her with an expression she had never seen on him before, something stripped of its usual composure, something that looked very close to the end of a certain kind of patience. "He gave them our client data," Miles said. "Whitmore has our client data, and he used it to close off our options." "Yes." "That's not competitive, that's—" He stopped. "Can we sue Finch?" "For sharing information we gave him voluntarily." She was already walking. He fell into step beside her. "It would take years. It would cost more than we have. And while we were litigating, Golden Phoenix would finish the job." "So what do we do?" It wasn't a question with a rising inflection. It was flat, the sound of a person who has reached the place where the options they thought they had no longer exist and is waiting to hear what exists instead. Jenny stopped walking. She stood on the sidewalk outside the Meridian building, on High Street in Columbus, with the traffic going past and the winter light flat and pale above the buildings. And she thought about something Derek had said once, years ago, in a different city, in a different kind of desperate moment, When she'd come home to find their father had taken the money, and she'd felt for the first time what it meant to have the ground pulled from beneath something you'd built with your bare hands. He'd said, "You can't protect something you're holding too tight. You have to be willing to throw it first." She hadn't understood it then. She understood it now. She turned to Miles. "I need you to trust me for the next 48 hours without me being able to tell you exactly where this is going." He looked at her. His jaw was tight. His coat was open and the wind was moving the lapels. He looked like a man standing at the edge of something he couldn't see the bottom of. "I've trusted you since the diner," he said. "I know, this is different." She held his eyes. "What I'm about to do is going to look like the wrong move. For at least a day, maybe two, it's going to look like I've lost my mind or switched sides or given up. I need you to hold on until it makes sense." Miles stared at her. The wind moved. A cab went past. 48 hours, he said. She nodded. She took out her phone and she called a number she had not called in 4 years, a number she still knew by memory because some numbers embed themselves below the level of conscious recall and live there permanently, associated not with the person, but with the specific weight of what that person represented at the time. The number mattered most. The phone rang 3 times. David Marsh answered. "David," she said, "I need you to set up a meeting with Gerald Whitmore. Tell him I want to discuss his offer." A silence. Then David said, "Jenny." "Tell him I'm ready to talk terms," she said. "Tell him I'll come to him." She hung up. Miles was watching her. She put the phone in her pocket. The thing building in her chest was not surrender, and it was not defeat, and it was not the particular hollowness of a person who has run out of options. It was something she had felt exactly once before in her life, standing in a parking lot in February, with a small box in her hands, something that felt like the end of one version of herself and the beginning of something she hadn't named yet, because the naming would come later, after, when there was time for it. She started walking toward the parking garage. Miles fell into step beside her and did not ask the question she could feel him holding, and that restraint, that particular discipline of trust under pressure, was the thing that told her she had chosen the right partner when she'd signed her name below his on a piece of paper in a second-hand office above a dry cleaning shop. She was going to walk into Gerald Whitmore's world. She was going to let him believe he had won. And somewhere in the space between that belief and the truth, she was going to find the one thing he had not accounted for, the thing that Finch's package, for all its detail, could not have given him, because it existed not in documents or projections or methodology frameworks, but in the specific, accumulated, irreplaceable knowledge of a woman who had spent 10 years inside the machine he was trying to replicate, learning not just how it worked, but exactly, precisely, where it was about to break. David Marsh called back in 40 minutes. Gerald Whitmore would see her Thursday at 2. The Golden Phoenix building. 22nd floor, the executive suite she had never once been invited into during 10 years of making the floors below it profitable. She said thank you and hung up and did not allow herself to think about the symmetry of it until she was alone in her car. 2 days. She had 2 days to build the thing she was going to carry into that room. She did not go back to the Broad Street office. She drove to the Columbus Public Library on Grant Avenue, not because she needed their resources specifically, but because she needed a space that belonged to no one, that had no associations, that was just tables and light, and the particular concentrated silence of a place where people came to think. And she sat in the back corner of the second floor with her laptop and her notebook and a cup of coffee from the cart by the entrance, and she began to work. Not on the pitch, on the map. She drew it in her notebook, not a diagram exactly, more like a constellation. Every connection she knew of between Gerald Whitmore and the Columbus business community, every board position, every investment, every relationship she had observed or documented or inferred during 10 years of working inside a company he partially controlled. She drew it in pencil so she could erase, and she erased often, and she redrew, and the map grew more complex and then simplified as she began to understand which connections were load-bearing and which were decorative. At the center of it, after 2 hours, she had a shape she recognized. Gerald Whitmore's position depended on one thing above everything else: the belief, held consistently by the people around him, that his judgment was sound. His investments, his board seats, his capacity to make calls like the one he'd made to Carol Stanton's CEO. All of it ran on the credibility of his instincts. He was not a man who could afford to be visibly wrong, not publicly, not in a way that left a record. And he had made a mistake, not a moral mistake. She wasn't interested in moral mistakes. They were too easy and too common and too difficult to leverage cleanly. A structural mistake. A mistake in how he had chosen to acquire what he wanted from her. He had used Robert Finch to obtain confidential information. He had used that information to foreclose her investor options and then approach her with an offer that was, functionally, a demand dressed in polite language. And he had done all of this before she had agreed to anything, which meant he had moved against her interests in order to manufacture a situation in which she would have no choice but to accept his terms. That sequence of events was documented. Not perfectly, not in the way that a lawyer would want, but in emails and call logs and the Caldwell connection and Carol Stanton's account of what Whitmore had told her CEO that Monday morning, information that Carol had shared with Jenny not out of loyalty, but out of the specific discomfort of a professional who had been put in an awkward position and wanted the record to reflect that she had been honest about it. Jenny called Carol Stanton on Tuesday morning from the library parking lot. "I'm not calling to reopen the partnership discussion," she said. "I'm calling to ask one question." Carol waited. "The document Whitmore shared with your CEO, the methodology overview with New Line's branding and client data, would your CEO be willing to confirm in writing that he received it?" A long pause. "That's a significant ask." "I know. It puts us in the middle of something we'd prefer." "Carol." Jenny kept her voice level. "He used your organization to deliver a message to me. You're already in the middle of it. What I'm asking is whether you're willing to let the record reflect what actually happened." Another pause. Longer. "I'll speak with him." She called Miles next. He answered on the first ring. "Where are you?" "Library. I need you to pull every email thread between us and Finch. Every document we sent him. Timestamps on everything. I need a clean chronological record of what he received and when." A beat. "You're building a case." "I'm building leverage," she said. "There's a difference." "What kind of leverage?" "The kind that works better as a threat than a lawsuit." She paused. "Miles, do you trust me? You asked me that on Monday. I'm asking again." "Yes," he said. "But I'm not sleeping well." "Me neither. Pull the emails." She went home that night and sat with Derek and told him everything. And Derek listened the way he always listened, with his full attention and without the impulse to interrupt that most people could not suppress when a story got complicated. And when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Whitmore thinks you're coming Thursday to negotiate," Derek said. "Yes." "You're not." "No." He looked at her. "What happens if he doesn't care about the leverage? If he's far enough insulated that the documentation doesn't matter to him?" She looked at the table, at the scratch along the edge. "Then I lose." "Cleanly?" "As cleanly as I can arrange it." Derek nodded. He didn't tell her it would be fine. He didn't tell her she'd figure it out. They had been past that kind of comfort for a long time. What he did was get up and heat water for tea, the particular domestic continuity of that gesture, the specific sound of the tap, the click of the burner, the small noises of a life being maintained, and bring a mug to her without asking whether she wanted one, because he knew she did. She drank it. She slept 5 hours. Thursday arrived the way high-pressure days always arrived for her, sharper than normal days, the edges of things more defined, the quality of light cleaner. She was awake at 5. She made coffee. She read through her notes one more time, not to learn anything new from them, but to settle them into their final form in her mind. The way you run through a speech, not to memorize it, but to let it become part of your body's knowledge, rather than just your head's. She dressed carefully. Not to impress. She had learned years ago that dressing to impress in a room like the one she was walking into was a concession that read as weakness, the particular weakness of wanting to belong to a world that had not invited you. She dressed to be taken seriously, which was different. A darker coat, clean lines, the kind of presence that asked nothing from the room because it had already decided what it was. Miles met her in the Golden Phoenix parking garage at 1:45. He was already there when she pulled in, standing beside his car with his hands in his coat pockets, and he looked like he hadn't slept much either. The particular pallor and tightness around the eyes, that came from nights spent turning a problem over without finding the place where it resolved. "You get the emails," she said. "Sent them to your phone this morning, chronological, time-stamped, with the document metadata." He looked at her. Carol Stanton's CEO responded. Her chest did something. "And?" "Written confirmation that Gerald Whitmore shared a document containing New Line's proprietary client data and methodology materials in a call on Monday morning." He paused. He was not happy about being asked, apparently, but he confirmed it. She breathed out slowly. "That's enough," she said. "Is it?" "It's enough for what I need." They walked into the building together. The lobby of Golden Phoenix was the same lobby she had walked through for 10 years. The same marble floor and the same Whitmore name on the wall and the same security desk where Marcus, a different Marcus, not Hale, the building Marcus, the one who'd always waved her through, had once recognized her on sight. The man at the desk now was unfamiliar. She signed in. She took a visitor badge. She clipped it to her coat. The elevator to the 22nd floor was mirrored, and she looked at herself on the way up, briefly, without the particular narcissism or the particular insecurity that makes some people unable to look at themselves before a fight. She just looked. A woman in a dark coat with a laptop bag and a phone in her pocket that contained, among other things, a confirmation email from the CEO of Meridian Group, just checking that she was still there, still herself, still the person who had made the decisions that had led to this particular elevator at this particular moment. She was. The doors opened. The 22nd floor was the kind of space that had been designed to communicate, without vulgarity, that the people who occupied it were several categories above the ones who didn't. High ceilings, specific art. A receptionist who smiled with the professional warmth of someone who understood their function perfectly. Jenny gave her name. She was expected. They were shown to a conference room, not Whitmore's office, which told her something. He wanted a table between them, the formal geometry of a business meeting rather than the more casual and revealing environment of a personal space. She noted it. She sat on the side of the table that faced the door. Gerald Whitmore came in 2 minutes after them. He had someone with him, a younger man, 30s, legal bearing, the kind of person who was present not to speak but to listen and record. Whitmore sat. The young man sat to his left. Jenny looked at Miles. Miles looked at her. Neither of them acknowledged the additional presence. "Ms. Calloway," Whitmore said. "Mr. Arden. Thank you for coming." "Thank you for the space," Jenny said. Whitmore folded his hands. "I imagine you've had time to consider our proposal." "I have." "Good." He leaned back slightly. The gesture of a man settling in, comfortable with the pace, certain of the direction. "I should tell you that our analytics division has moved quickly this week. We've brought on 2 enterprise clients who were in your pipeline." He said it evenly, without relish, which was somehow worse than relish. "I want you to understand that the offer remains genuine, but the landscape is shifting." Jenny let that land. She let the silence hold for 4 full seconds, which in a room with this much tension felt like considerably longer. "I understand," she said. "I want to ask you a question before we discuss terms." Whitmore gestured with one hand. "Proceed." "The 2 clients in our pipeline that your team brought on this week," she said. "How did your team identify them as targets?" A slight pause. "Almost invisible." "Our business development team has broad market visibility." "Of course." She opened her laptop. Not quickly, not dramatically, with the measured deliberateness of someone who has decided exactly what they're doing and is doing it at the pace that serves them best. "I'm looking at a document right now. It's a communication log between your office and Robert Finch, reconstructed from metadata and confirmed email records, showing the transmission of New Line's confidential client projection data on the 14th of February. She turned the laptop slightly toward him, not fully, just enough. "2 of the names on that client list appear to be the clients your team contacted this week." The young man to Whitmore's left made a small movement, a slight shift of weight, the involuntary response of someone whose professional training is at war with their instincts. Whitmore did not move. "That's a serious allegation," he said. "It's a documented sequence of events," Jenny said. I prefer not to call it an allegation because that language implies uncertainty. She closed the laptop. I have written confirmation from Carol Stanton's CEO at Meridian that you shared our proprietary materials in a call on Monday morning. I have the Finch transmission metadata. I have the client contact timeline. She paused. What I have is a story. A very specific, very well-documented story about how a man of your position used confidential business intelligence obtained through a compromised investor relationship to foreclose a smaller company's options and manufacture a coercive negotiating environment. The room was very quiet. That story, Jenny continued, and her voice was level, not cold, not hot. The voice of someone who is neither performing anger nor suppressing it, but has simply moved past the place where those temperatures apply, is currently in a document on my laptop. It will also be in documents held by my attorney, by Miles's attorney, and in a detailed written account that I have prepared for the Columbus Business Journal, whose reporter has already expressed interest in New Line's growth trajectory. She looked at him. I have not sent that account. I'm here because I wanted to give you the opportunity to discuss a different kind of arrangement. Gerald Whitmore looked at her for a long time. The young man said nothing. He had stopped making small movements. He was very still. What kind of arrangement? Whitmore said. It was not a question with a rise at the end. It was flat. The voice of a man who has reassessed a situation and is now processing the reassessment. Jenny felt her pulse in her fingertips. Not panic, something cleaner, something that had adrenaline in it but also precision. The specific physiological state of a person operating at the exact edge of their capacity and finding that the edge is further out than they'd estimated. New Line remains fully independent, she said. No equity transfer to Golden Phoenix, no licensing arrangement, no advisory board seat. She held his eyes. Your analytics division ceases using our client data and our methodology framework. In writing. Signed by your general counsel. Whitmore's jaw moved slightly. And in exchange. In exchange, the document stays on my laptop. The business journal contact remains a contact, not a source. And we conduct our business in separate lanes without interference. She paused. You keep what you've built. We keep what we've built. And nobody has to spend the next 3 years explaining to a court why a man with your reputation chose to compromise a smaller company through a fund manager relationship. Silence. The heating in the room was almost inaudible, just a faint circulation of air. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Columbus spread in every direction, gray and flat and indifferent. Jenny did not look at the city. She kept her eyes on Whitmore's face, and she waited, because she had done everything she could do to bring this to a point where waiting was the only remaining action available to her. Whitmore unfolded his hands. He placed his palms flat on the table. He looked at his own hands for a moment. I'll need to speak with counsel, he said. Of course, Jenny said. I'll need an answer by Friday morning. If I don't have one, the journal conversation happens Friday afternoon. She said it without heat, without threat in the conventional sense. Just as a fact being stated by a person who means it and has made peace with the cost of meaning it. Whitmore looked up from his hands. He looked at her with an expression she could not entirely read. There was assessment in it, and something she might have called respect if she'd been in a more generous mood, and something else beneath both of those. Something older and more fundamental. The look of a man who has encountered an obstacle that is not moving and is genuinely uncertain, possibly for the first time in some years, what to do about it. He stood. The young man stood with him. I'll be in touch before Friday, Whitmore said. Jenny stood. Miles stood. They shook hands across the table, and this handshake was entirely different from the ones at Meridian. It had weight in it, and presence. The handshake of two people who have each found the edges of where the other one is willing to go and are now standing at those edges looking at each other. Whitmore left. The young man left. The door closed. Jenny and Miles stood alone in the conference room on the 22nd floor of the Golden Phoenix building with the Columbus skyline behind the glass, and the room felt different now. Lighter, or not lighter exactly, but changed, the way a room changes after a certain kind of pressure has passed through it. Miles said, You didn't tell me about the journal. I know. Is that real? Did you actually contact them? Jenny picked up her laptop bag. The reporter called me 2 weeks ago about the Hale contract. I told him I'd be in touch. Miles stared at her. So you had a contact, not a source agreement. Correct. That's... He stopped. He made the sound that wasn't quite a laugh, the one she'd heard Derek make in the kitchen. That's terrifying. It was enough, she said. They walked to the elevator. The receptionist smiled at them on the way out. Jenny returned the badge. She walked through the lobby, past the Whitmore name on the wall without looking at it, past the security desk, through the glass doors, into the parking garage. Outside, the February air hit her face and she stopped walking. Her hands were shaking. Not badly, just a fine, controlled tremor, the kind the body produces when it has been maintaining a sustained override of its own alarm systems and has been given a moment of release. She put one hand against the side of her car and just breathed. In, out. The cold filling her lungs and the shaking working itself out of her hands over the course of about 40 seconds. Miles stood beside her without saying anything. I need food, she said. Yeah, he said. Me too. They went to the same diner on 5th Street where they'd had their first meeting, and they sat in the same vinyl booth, and Jenny ordered the same coffee in the heavy white mug, and they sat in something that was not quite silence and not quite conversation for a while. He's going to call Friday morning, Miles said. Yes. You're sure? Men like Whitmore don't let things sit in uncertainty longer than they need to. He'll have talked to counsel by tomorrow afternoon and he'll know the exposure is real. She wrapped both hands around the mug. He'll call. And if he doesn't? She looked at the coffee. Then I call the Journal Friday afternoon and we burn it down and see what grows from the ash. Miles was quiet. Then, I need to ask you something and I need you to answer me straight. She looked up. If he calls and he agrees. If we get the independence, the written agreement, the whole thing. He held her eyes. Is that enough? Are we safe? Or does he find another angle in 6 months? It was the right question. She had been sitting with it since Tuesday morning in the library parking lot, turning it over, testing it from different sides. He could find another angle, she said, if we stay small enough to be worth targeting and not large enough to be worth protecting. She set the mug down. Which means the answer to that question is the same answer it's always been. We have to grow faster than he can move against us. And the investment? We find different investors, not Finch's network, not Caldwell's network. Younger money, people who don't have board relationships with the generation above them yet. She paused. There's a woman. Her name is Sandra Park. She runs an early-stage fund out of Cincinnati, second-generation Korean American, built her portfolio entirely from companies that got passed over by legacy capital. She looked at Miles. I found her profile while I was building the investor research, and I put her at the bottom of the list because she seemed like a longer shot. I think she's the shot. Miles held her eyes for a moment. You've already drafted the email. I drafted it Tuesday night. He made the sound again, the almost laugh. He shook his head, not with exasperation, but with something that had fondness in it, the specific fondness of a person for someone whose relentlessness they have stopped being surprised by and started being grateful for. Send it, he said. She sent it from her phone at the table. Right then, because waiting was a habit of hers she was still working to break. They stayed in the diner another hour. They talked about the Hale contract implementation timeline, about the platform upgrades that needed to happen before they could take on enterprise scale, about Priya's back pay and whether there was now enough in the account to clear it in full. The conversation was practical and forward-facing and had the particular quality of two people who have been through something hard together and are orienting without ceremony toward the next thing. Jenny drove home at 6:30. Derek was in the kitchen again, and she told him what had happened, and he listened, and this time when she finished, he said, He'll call. I know. And then what? And then we build, she said. Fast, before he recovers his footing. Derek looked at her. How fast? As fast as we've ever done anything. She went to bed at 10. She lay in the dark. Her hands had stopped shaking hours ago. She was not afraid. Fear required uncertainty about what you were going to do. And Jenny had not been uncertain about what she was going to do since Tuesday morning in the library, when the map in her notebook had crystallized and she had seen the shape of the only move that could work. What she felt now was something different. something that had the quality of suspension, the specific tension of standing at the top of something and having committed to the fall and waiting for gravity to confirm what you already know. She slept. Her phone rang at 7:49 Friday morning. Gerald Whitmore's voice was the same quality as the first call, controlled, practiced, the voice of a man who had been in difficult situations before and had learned to conduct himself in them with consistency. He did not begin with pleasantries. "Counsel has reviewed the situation," he said. Jenny sat up in bed. Her voice, when she answered, was level and awake, because she had been half awake for the past 20 minutes, in the particular light sleep of a person whose body knows something is coming. "And," she said, "we're prepared to execute the agreement as outlined, full independence for New Line, written cessation of the methodology usage, no further contact with your client pipeline." She said nothing. "There are two conditions," Whitmore said. Her jaw tightened. "The document you described, the one currently on your laptop and with your attorneys. We want confirmation that it remains private, not destroyed. I understand that's not something you'd agree to, but private, held rather than published, as long as the terms are honored." "That was already implicit in what I offered," she said. "What's the second condition?" A pause, slightly longer than his others. "I want to know how you knew about Finch." She was quiet for a moment. "Does that matter?" "It matters to me." She looked at the window. The early morning light was just beginning to define the curtains, that particular blue-gray of February dawn. "I knew you'd contact whoever we were talking to," she said. "I didn't know it would be Finch specifically until he called you, but I knew someone would make that call, because it's what I would have done if I were in your position, and I needed to understand the landscape before making an offer." Silence. "You expected it," he said. "I was prepared for it." Another pause. She heard him breathe, just once, the slight sound of a man processing something he hadn't expected to encounter. "The agreement will be with your attorney by Monday," he said. "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore." She hung up. She sat on the edge of her bed with her phone in both hands and her elbows on her knees, and her hair not yet arranged and the morning light not yet fully arrived, and she stayed there for a long time, very still, not celebrating, not weeping, not performing anything for an audience that didn't exist, just sitting with it, just letting the weight of what had just happened find its proper place inside her. Not triumph, exactly, because triumph required an enemy, and she was too tired and too pragmatic to spend energy on enemies, but something, a settlement. The specific settling of a person who has carried something long enough and hard enough that the moment it is put down, the absence of the weight is its own complicated thing. She showered, she dressed, she made coffee. Derek came into the kitchen at 8:15 and looked at her face and said, "He called." "He called." Derek was quiet for a moment. Then, "Is it over?" "This part," she said. He nodded. He poured himself coffee. He sat across from her at the kitchen table with the scratch along the edge and the morning light coming through the window, and they didn't say anything else for a while, just sat there together in the quiet of what had been won and what still needed to be built. The particular silence of two people who had been through enough together that the silence itself was a kind of language. Jenny's phone buzzed on the table. She looked at it. Sandra Park. The email response. 7 words in the subject line. Interested. "Are you available this week?" She looked up from the phone. She looked at Derek. She felt something in her chest, not the suspended tension of before, not the cold clarity of the conference room, something warmer and more dangerous, something that had the specific electricity of a beginning, the sensation she associated not with safety, but with the possibility of something real. She picked up her phone. She started typing. And in the Golden Phoenix building across the city, on a floor she had never worked on but had now stood in and looked out from, a man named Gerald Whitmore sat in his office with his hands folded on his desk and stared at the city below him, and the expression on his face was one that the people around him had rarely seen. Not defeat, not quite, but the particular stillness of a man who has encountered the limits of what his position can accomplish against someone who has decided, with the specific conviction that comes from having nothing left to lose, that she is not moving. And in an office above a dry cleaning shop on Broad Street, Miles Arden was reading the Sandra Park email over Jenny's shoulder when she forwarded it to him, and he said something, and she said something back, and Priya spun her chair around. And whatever was said in that room in that moment was the kind of thing that doesn't make it into formal accounts of how companies get built, the messy human noise of a team that has survived something together and is standing on the other side of it, changed. Jenny closed her laptop. She opened it again. She had work to do, and Sandra Park was waiting. And the thing she had been building since the morning she walked out of this building with a small box in her hands was not finished, was nowhere near finished. And the distance between where it was and where it needed to go was the most important distance she had ever committed to crossing. And she was going to cross it, one calculation at a time, with every tool she had ever built and every lesson she had ever paid for and every version of herself she had ever had to become in order to survive the thing that was trying to stop her from becoming the next one. She began to type. Sandra Park met them on a Wednesday. Not in Cincinnati, where her fund was based, and not in a borrowed conference room or a hotel lobby or any of the neutral spaces that investor meetings typically occupied. She had suggested a coffee shop on Neal Avenue, a small place with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu, the kind of establishment that had survived 3 rounds of neighborhood gentrification by being genuinely good at the one thing it did. Jenny arrived first. She had been arriving first to meetings for so long that the habit had stopped feeling like strategy and had become simply the way she moved through the world, early, positioned, already reading the room before anyone else entered it. Sandra Park came through the door at 9:58, and Jenny recognized her immediately, not from the photos she'd found online, but from the way she moved, the specific efficiency of a person who had learned that time was the one resource that could not be recovered once spent. She was 41, compact, with the direct gaze of someone who had been underestimated in enough rooms to have stopped finding it surprising and had redirected that energy entirely into outcomes. She sat down. She ordered black coffee. She looked at Jenny and said, "Tell me what happened with Finch." Jenny looked at her. "I know Robert," Sandra said. "Not well. Well enough to know that you approached him first and he went to Whitmore and you're now sitting across from me, which means either you're desperate or you're smart about which doors close and which ones that forces open." She picked up her coffee. "Which is it?" "Both," Jenny said. Sandra nodded. "Good. Desperate and smart is fundable. Just desperate isn't." They talked for 2 hours and 20 minutes, and the conversation had a quality that Jenny had experienced only a handful of times in her professional life. The quality of genuine equivalence, of two people operating at comparable frequencies without the friction of one needing to establish credibility with the other. Sandra asked hard questions, the kind that required real answers rather than practiced ones. And Jenny gave her real answers, including the ones that reflected badly on decisions she'd made and the ones that required her to describe exactly how close they'd come to losing everything in the weeks before Whitmore's Friday morning call. Sandra listened to all of it without changing her expression significantly. She had the particular stillness of someone who had heard many versions of many stories and had learned to listen for the architecture beneath them, rather than the presentation on top. When Jenny finished, Sandra said, "What do you need?" Not how much, not what's the ask. What do you need? Jenny told her. Sandra looked at the number for a moment. "I can do 10. The additional 2 needs to come from a co-investor. I have someone in mind, a woman in Cleveland who focuses on analytics infrastructure. I'll make the introduction this week." She set her cup down. "I have 2 conditions." Jenny waited. "First, I want quarterly transparency, not just financials, strategic decisions, client losses, internal conflicts. I've watched too many companies fail because their investors were the last to know about the problems." She met Jenny's eyes. "If something goes wrong, I hear about it before it's a crisis." "Agreed," Jenny said. "Second," Sandra paused, "I want to know what you're going to do about Adam Whitmore." Jenny looked at her. "Adam Whitmore is running Golden Phoenix's client growth division." "I know what he's doing. I'm asking what you're going to do about it. Because if you're building what I think you're building, you're going to be in his market inside 18 months, and I need to know whether your strategy accounts for that or whether it's something you're planning to manage emotionally." The word emotionally landed with precision. Jenny recognized the question beneath the question. Whether the decade of being overlooked, the promotion that went to a name rather than a record, the years of making someone else's company profitable while standing in the background, whether all of that was something she had processed into fuel or something that was still driving the car. "I'm not building this to beat Adam Whitmore," Jenny said. "I'm building it because the methodology works, and the market needs it, and I spent 10 years watching it not be built at the speed it should have been built because the people making decisions were optimizing for something other than what was true." She held Sandra's gaze. "Adam Whitmore is a variable, not an objective." Sandra looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded once, the nod of a person who has heard the answer they were looking for and is now done with that particular question. "I'll have the term sheet to you by Friday," she said. She stood. She shook Jenny's hand. She shook Miles's hand. She walked out of the coffee shop and the door closed behind her, and Miles said very quietly, "She's going to do it." "Yes," Jenny said. "How do you know?" "Because she didn't ask about our exit strategy." Miles thought about that. "Meaning she's not thinking about when to get out. Meaning she's thinking about what we build." The term sheet arrived Thursday, one day early. Jenny read it twice, sent it to their attorney, received confirmation that it was clean and fair and contained none of the structural provisions that would quietly erode their independence over time, and signed it on a Friday morning that felt entirely different from the last Friday morning that had mattered. Not lighter, not easier, but moving in a direction that was finally, unambiguously, her own. The co-investor Sandra had mentioned, a woman named Helen Cho, who ran an analytics-focused fund from Cleveland, called Jenny directly the following week. The call lasted 35 minutes. Helen asked 3 questions, all of them technical, all of them about the platform architecture and its capacity to scale to enterprise volume without degrading the accuracy of the behavioral modeling. Jenny answered them. Helen said she'd have a decision by end of week. She had a decision by Wednesday. Newline closed its first institutional round on a Tuesday in April. $12 million split between Sandra Park's fund and Helen Cho's, with the terms Jenny had outlined and the operational independence she had demanded from the beginning. Miles stood in the Broad Street office and looked at the signed documents on his laptop screen with an expression she had never seen on him before, something that was past relief and past satisfaction, something that had the quality of a man who has been running towards something for long enough that the moment of arrival doesn't feel like stopping, but like a different kind of movement. Priya received her full back pay that afternoon. She did not make a big thing of it. She said thank you, put the check in her bag, and turned back to her screen. Jenny watched this and thought about what it meant to be the kind of person who kept showing up anyway, before the money arrived, and understood it not as naivety, but as its own form of intelligence. The intelligence of someone who could read the structural truth of a thing before the surface evidence confirmed it. They hired 3 senior client executives over the following 2 months. Jenny ran every interview herself, not because she didn't trust Miles's judgment, but because she understood that the people they brought in now would establish the culture of the next version of Newline, and culture, in her experience, was not something you could retrofit after the fact. You built it into the foundation, or you rebuilt it at enormous cost later. She chose carefully. She chose people who asked hard questions during their interviews. She chose people who pushed back on things that should be pushed back on, and accepted the things that were right. She chose people who looked, in some quality she couldn't name precisely but recognized immediately, like people who had earned what they knew. Golden Phoenix receded from the foreground of her attention gradually, the way a headache recedes. You notice one day that it's been an hour since you thought about it, and then half a day, and then you only remember it when something specific brings it back. What brought it back, 8 months after the Friday morning call with Gerald Whitmore, was a phone call from David Marsh. She almost didn't answer. She'd screened his calls before, in the early months after leaving, not out of animosity, but out of the particular exhaustion of a person who has enough to carry without also carrying the emotional weight of conversations that had no clear purpose. But it was a Tuesday afternoon in November, and she was between meetings, and something, the same instinct that had made her answer Gerald Whitmore's call from an unknown number on a Saturday morning, made her pick up. "David," she said. "Jenny." He sounded older. She noted this without judgment, just registered it, the slight compression of his voice. the way it had lost some of its practiced roundness. "I don't know if this is appropriate to call." "You called," she said. "Go ahead." A pause. "Golden Phoenix is in trouble. Not public trouble. Not yet. But the analytics division is underperforming badly, and Adam's growth strategy has damaged 3 of our biggest long-term accounts. And the board is—" He stopped. "There's going to be a restructuring." She was quiet. "I'm calling because I wanted you to know before it's public," he said. "And because I wanted to say—" He stopped again. She heard him breathing on the other end of the line, the slightly effortful breathing of a man choosing words carefully in a moment that doesn't have obvious right ones. "I should have fought harder for you. When the decision was made. I knew it was wrong. I knew what you'd built and what he hadn't. And I told myself the structure of the situation was out of my hands, and that was—" He paused. "That was a coward's accounting of it." The November light was coming through the office window, flat and gray, the same quality it had been on the February morning she'd driven away from this building with a box of her things in the back seat. She looked at it. "I know," she said, because she did. She had always known, with the clear-eyed assessment she applied to everything, that David Marsh had not been ignorant of the injustice. He had been unwilling to pay the price of opposing it, which was a different thing, a human thing, a thing she understood even as she had refused to accept it. "I'm sorry," he said. She thought about whether that word landed the way it was supposed to land. She thought about the 10 years she'd spent in that building making herself indispensable to people who treated indispensability as a renewable resource. She thought about the specific moment, standing at the back of a conference room when the applause started. "I know," she said again, and meant it differently the second time. She told Miles about the call that evening, briefly, without extensive commentary. He listened. He said, "What does it mean for us?" "Possibly nothing," she said. "Possibly an opportunity, depending on what the restructuring looks like and which clients become available." She paused. "I want to wait and see what develops before we decide." He nodded. "Okay." "Miles." She looked at him across the desk. "When the time comes, if the time comes, I want to handle it right. Not fast. Right." He held her eyes. "I know." What developed over the following 3 months was a slow public unraveling of the kind that had been inevitable from the moment Adam Whitmore had been given a position he was not prepared to hold. The analytics division's numbers came out in a shareholder communication in December that used language carefully chosen to obscure how bad they were, which had the effect, with anyone who knew how to read that language, of making them look worse. 2 of the damaged long-term accounts became public when the clients in question mentioned their departure in industry publications. A 3rd issued a statement. The board moved in January. Adam's role was restructured. The official language was realignment of leadership responsibilities, which was the corporate equivalent of the particular careful silence Jenny had encountered in rooms where difficult truths were being managed rather than spoken. He retained a title. The title had been emptied of the thing that had made it matter. It was Gerald Whitmore who called her this time. Not David. Gerald himself on a Thursday morning, his voice carrying the same controlled quality as always, but with something different in the register, something that had moved slightly from the tone of a man who controls the conversation to the tone of a man who is initiating one he is less certain about. "Golden Phoenix is exploring strategic options," he said. "I've read the shareholder communication," Jenny said. "Our board is interested in conversations with companies that could provide operational stability and a proven client retention methodology." A pause. "I'm calling to ask whether Newline would be open to acquisition discussions." Jenny looked out the window of the Broad Street office. The dry cleaning shop below had changed hands in October, and the new owners had painted the sign a different color, and the street looked slightly different as a result, the small ways in which things changed while you were busy building other things. "We'd be open to a conversation," she said, "on our terms." "Of course," Whitmore said. And in that of course she heard the full weight of everything that had happened between the first time he'd said those words to her and now, the document that still sat on her laptop and with her attorneys, the Friday morning call, the agreement he'd signed, the distance between what he'd expected from her and what she'd turned out to be. She said, I'll have our attorney reach out to your general counsel to establish a framework. That works, he said. Neither of them said anything further about what had preceded this. There was nothing to say, or rather, everything had already been said in the ways that mattered, in signed documents and executed agreements and the particular outcomes that followed from the particular decisions each of them had made. Jenny had learned in 15 years of carrying more than she should have had to carry at various ages that the accounting of things did not always come in the form you expected or at the moment you thought it would arrive, but that it came. That the structural logic of sustained effort and honest work eventually expressed itself, not as justice in any dramatic sense, but as simple consequence. The consequence of having built something real in a world that could tell the difference, eventually, between what was real and what was constructed from position and name. The acquisition process took 4 months. It was not clean. There were weeks that were ugly in the specific way of complex negotiations where every party has interests that don't fully align, and the people managing those interests are simultaneously trying to protect them and reach an agreement and are therefore in a state of permanent low-grade conflict. There were nights when Jenny drove home from the attorney's office at 10 or 11 o'clock and sat in her car in the driveway of the house that was now fully paid. They had made the final mortgage payment in February, a fact that had passed with less ceremony than she'd expected. Just a number disappearing from a column, Derek saying there it is, and her saying there it is, and felt the accumulated weight of the process pressing on her in the specific way of something important that is taking longer than patience naturally allows. She did not let herself rush it. She had learned in the years since the conference room that rushing important things to escape the discomfort of their duration was one of the most expensive mistakes a person could make. The discomfort was information. The resistance in the negotiation was information. The specific points at which Golden Phoenix's legal team pushed back told her which elements of the deal they were most afraid of, which told her which elements to hold firmly and which to concede gracefully. She held the ones that mattered. The acquisition was announced on a Friday morning in May, 2 years and 3 months after Jenny had walked out of the Golden Phoenix building with a small box and no plan and a clarity in her chest that had felt like the beginning of something she hadn't named yet. She stood in the Broad Street office when the announcement went public and watched her phone and Miles's phone and Priya's phone. Priya, who was now Director of Client Operations, a title that fit her the way a well-made coat fits, naturally and without adjustment, all vibrate and light up simultaneously with the same news arriving through different channels, and the room had a quality she associated with very few moments in her experience, the quality of something having completed its arc. She did not feel triumphant. She felt something more durable than triumph, something that had weight and texture and did not require an audience. The particular private satisfaction of a person who has done something difficult in full, without cutting corners, without burning what didn't need to be burned, without becoming in the process something she wouldn't recognize. There was a company event scheduled for the following Thursday, a joint meeting of both companies' staff, the first formal gathering since the acquisition, held in the Golden Phoenix building because it was larger, in the main conference room on the 4th floor, the same room where Jenny had stood at the back wall 11 years ago and listened to David Marsh read a name that wasn't hers from a podium. She drove to the building on Thursday morning and parked in the visitor lot, which she would continue using until the transition of facilities was complete because there was a difference between what was technically now permissible and what felt right, and she had always navigated by that difference. She took the elevator to the 4th floor. She walked down the corridor to the conference room. She stood outside the door for a moment. She was not trying to collect herself. She was simply standing there, in the particular way of a person who has learned that some moments are worth inhabiting fully rather than moving through quickly. Who has learned this not from wisdom, but from the accumulated experience of having moved through things too quickly and discovered afterward what had been lost in the rushing. She pushed open the door. The room was full. Staff from both companies, 200 and some people, the merged landscape of two organizations that had been in competition and were now attempting the difficult work of becoming something coherent together. There was the noise of many conversations, the particular human ambient sound of a large group before a formal program begins, and it changed slightly when she came in. Not dramatically, not the silencing she might have imagined years ago when she'd sometimes thought about moments like this in the abstract, but a shift, a ripple, the way a room acknowledges a presence that has meaning to it. Miles was near the front, He caught her eye and held it for a moment, and whatever passed between them in that look contained everything that the 4 months of acquisition and the 18 months before it and the first meeting in a diner on Fifth Street had been the full unabbreviated weight of what it meant to have chosen each other as partners in something that could have failed in 15 different ways and had chosen, instead, to not fail. She walked to the front of the room. She passed faces she recognized, people she had trained, people she had worked alongside for a decade, people who had applauded in this room when someone else's name was called. She did not look for those faces specifically. She did not avoid them. She passed through the room the way she had always moved through difficult spaces. Without performance, without concealment, just present, just herself, just the woman who was about to stand at the front of this particular room and speak to these particular people about what was going to happen next. She reached the podium. She looked out at the room. For a moment she didn't speak, and the room settled into a quiet that had something anticipatory in it. The particular quiet of a group waiting for a person they have heard about in various ways from various sources to become real in front of them. She said, "I want to start by being honest with you about something." The room was very quiet. Some of you worked here when I worked here. Some of you know what I built in this building, and some of you know how I left it. She kept her voice even, not flat. Even, which was different, which meant she was present in every word without letting any single word carry more than its share. I'm not standing here because I won something. I'm standing here because something I built proved that it worked, and something that was built here proved that it needed help. And those two facts eventually produced a third fact, which is this room today, all of us together trying to figure out what we make of it. She paused. I'm not going to tell you that everything is going to be fine. I don't know that. Neither do you. What I can tell you is that the way we operate going forward will be based on what is true and what is working, not on who has the right name or the right connection or who arrived here first. She looked across the room, at no single face but at the collective, at the assembled reality of all these people who had shown up and were waiting to understand what they'd shown up for. If you do good work, it will be seen. If you see a problem, you'll be heard when you name it. If you're carrying something that's not working, we want to know before it breaks. She stopped. That's not a promise about outcomes. It's a promise about how we'll operate. There's a difference, and I think most of you have been in enough rooms to know why that difference matters. The silence after she stopped was the kind that a room makes when it is genuinely absorbing something rather than waiting for the next thing. She stood in it without filling it. Then Miles stepped to the podium beside her and the meeting continued. The practical business of what came next, the organizational structure, the transition timeline, the specific details of how two companies with different systems and different cultures began the long, unglamorous work of becoming one thing. Jenny sat in the front row and listened and participated and answered questions when questions came to her, and the morning moved the way consequential mornings move, faster than expected, ordinary in its texture, significant only in the aggregate of what was being decided in it. At 11:30, she stepped out to make a call. She stood in the hallway outside the conference room. In the corridor she had walked hundreds of times, and she called Derek. He answered on the second ring. "How is it?" he said. She looked down the corridor, at the carpet, which was the same carpet, at the ceiling fixtures, which were the same fixtures, at the particular quality of light in a building she had spent 10 years of her life inside, which was exactly the same and completely different, and neither of those things was a paradox. "It's okay," she said. "Just okay." She thought about it. "It's what it is," which is more than what it was. Derek was quiet for a moment. "You okay?" "Yeah." She leaned against the wall. "I'm tired." "Go home after." "I will." "Derek," she said. "Yeah." "Thank you." She said it simply, without elaboration, because they were past the age of needing elaboration, had been past it for years, had built between them a communication that ran on the compressed language of shared history, where a single word could carry the weight of a sentence, and a sentence could carry the weight of years. "Stop thanking me," he said. "Come home." She smiled. "After." She hung up. She stood in the corridor for another moment, alone, in the particular quiet of a hallway when the rooms around it are occupied with other business. She thought about the scratch on the kitchen table that they had never fixed. She thought about a parking lot in February and a small box and a clarity that had felt like falling. She thought about a diner on Fifth Street and a napkin with a sketch on it, and a man who had believed in what she could see when she hadn't yet proven she could build it. She thought about her father's hands taking the money from the place she'd hidden it, the specific image of that, the way it had lived in her for 15 years as the original proof of the thing she'd known ever since without needing to relearn. That nothing built inside someone else's walls on someone else's terms would ever fully be hers. She had her own walls now. She pushed off from the wall. She walked back to the conference room door. She put her hand on it. She thought, this is not the end of anything. This is just the place where one thing stops and another starts, and the line between them is a door you open and walk through, and then it's just the next room, and you're in it, and there is work to do. She opened the door. She went back inside. The room was still full, still noisy with the business of two companies learning the shape of each other, and she found her seat and sat down and picked up her pen and her notebook, the same kind of notebook she had always used, the kind with the plain cover and the ruled pages, and she opened it to a clean page. At the top, she wrote nothing. She left the top of the page empty, the way she always did when she was beginning something she didn't yet have a name for. She put the pen to the page. She started writing.